I didn't mean to let anyone in. Not really, not fully. Not in the way that risks being seen without the safety of distance or a carefully rehearsed smile. But the truth is, I was already unraveling when you found me. Already living in a version of myself stitched together by silence and small, acceptable fragments, and the day we met wasn't extraordinary in any obvious way. Just one of those dull gray afternoons where the sky looks too tired to rain and the air feels like it forgot how to hold warmth. And I remember sitting alone on that chipped wooden bench outside the library with my headphones in but no music playing, pretending I was occupied so no one would ask if I was okay, because I didn't know how to answer that without making someone uncomfortable. And then you sat down beside me like you didn't notice the invisible signs I was hoping would keep everyone away. And for a long time, neither of us said anything. Just the sound of wind moving through bare trees and distant traffic. And I thought, maybe you'd leave like everyone else eventually did when I couldn't offer conversation or comfort or a version of myself that made sense. But instead, you pulled out a small notebook and started to sketch something quietly, your pencil moving like it was translating a language I didn't speak but somehow understood. And then, without looking up, you said, "I like this kind of quiet." And those 6 words undid something in me that I didn't even know was holding on so tightly, because it wasn't just that you were okay with silence, was that you welcomed it, sat with it, didn't fill it with questions or assumptions or nervous chatter. And it's strange how quickly something can shift when someone meets you where you are without trying to move you. How just a few minutes beside the right kind of presence can feel like the first deep breath you've taken in months. And after that day, you kept showing up, not in loud or demanding ways, but in small, consistent gestures, a thermos of tea handed to me on a cold morning without explanation, a quiet wave from across the hallway that didn't ask me to smile back, a message sent late at night that simply said, "Still here if you ever want to talk or not talk." And I wanted to respond. I really did. But I was still learning how to trust that kindness wouldn't turn into expectation, still learning how to believe that staying didn't mean waiting for me to become easier to hold. And the thing is, you never asked me to be anything other than what I already was. Never tried to fix me or decode me or drag me into light before I was ready. You just became this steady presence in the background of my quiet chaos, like a heartbeat I hadn't noticed until I realized it had always been there. And I think that's when I started to feel it, that ache that wasn't fear but hope. The terrifying possibility that maybe I didn't have to do all of this alone. That maybe, just maybe, you were going to stay long enough for me to stop bracing for goodbye the first time. I almost let myself fall apart in front of you was on a Thursday afternoon that didn't look like it was carrying anything heavy. The kind of day that passes quietly without headlines or thunder. But underneath the stillness, I was barely holding myself together, pretending like the weight in my chest was just fatigue or distraction, because I had become so good at hiding behind functional movements and familiar phrases that even I sometimes forgot I was breaking until something small pushed too hard against the walls I'd built. And that day, it was nothing dramatic, just a moment, your hand brushing mine by accident while we walked. A glance that lingered a second too long. The way your voice softened when you said my name, like it was a question you weren't trying to answer. And suddenly, I felt this wave rising in me. Not of sadness, but of vulnerability so sharp, it almost felt like pain. Like my body remembered what it meant to be witnessed and didn't know how to hold it. And I looked away quickly, pretending to check my phone, pretending to be somewhere else, because I didn't know how to explain that I was scared not of you, but of what it meant that I wanted so badly to trust you, and you didn't press or pry or ask me what was wrong. You just slowed your steps and walked beside me in silence, like you understood without needing the words. And when we got to my door, I thought about saying something, thought about inviting you in, or saying thank you, or anything that could make sense of the moment. But all I managed was a small nod and a quiet goodnight. And I could tell you heard. More than I said, because you smiled, not the kind of smile that tries to make things better, but the kind that says, I'll still be here tomorrow. And that night, I lay awake replaying everything, every glance, every pause. Every inch of closeness I almost leaned into and didn't, and I realized how long it had been since someone made me feel that safe. That seen, that gently understood, and the realization scared me more than I expected, not because I doubted you, but because I doubted myself, doubted that I could hold this kind of soft connection without breaking it. And I didn't know yet that what we were building wasn't fragile at all. It was the kind of friendship that grows slow and wide, that roots itself beneath the surface where no one can pull it up without care. And the more I let myself settle into it, the more I began to believe that maybe I didn't have to carry the ache alone. Maybe I could have someone beside me who didn't just tolerate the quiet, but made it feel like home. And that kind of presence, that kind of loyalty, that kind of gentleness, it became the place I returned to before I even realized I was leaving. The softest place I'd ever found, not in a location, but in you. There was a morning I almost didn't show up. Not to anything in particular, just to the day itself, because some days begin heavy and stay that way. Like the light can't find you, no matter how wide the sky opens. And I remember lying there with my phone face down, blinds half closed. Body still, but mind spiraling through all the invisible places where grief collects without permission. And I don't know what made me check my messages that day. Maybe instinct, maybe hope, maybe just habit. But there it was, your name glowing like a quiet reminder that not everything had left. And all you said was, stepping out for coffee. No pressure, but I'll be near the bench if you feel like air. And it was the most ordinary thing. But something about the way you didn't ask for anything and still made room for me stirred something fragile in me that I hadn't touched in a while. And I told myself I'd stay in bed. Told myself I'd let the moment pass. But an hour later, I found myself pulling on the nearest clothes, hair still unbrushed, heart pounding not from fear, but from the tender panic of showing up unguarded. And when I got there, you were already sitting with 2 cups, one in your hands, one waiting beside you, like you knew I'd come, even when I didn't. And you didn't make a scene or say anything like I'm glad you came. You just handed me the cup without looking up from your sketchbook. And I sat beside you like it was the most natural thing in the world to be completely seen and not spoken about, and for a while we just existed there. No pressure to fill the silence. No requirement to explain what part of me had nearly stayed curled in bed with the curtains drawn. Just a quiet togetherness that felt more like safety than anything I'd ever named as such. And I think that's when I realized the difference between the people who ask how you're doing and the ones who show up in the quiet before you know how to answer. And you've always been the second kind. The kind who doesn't flinch at broken mornings or unwashed hair or unread messages. The kind who waits with a second coffee and an unspoken understanding that not all showing up looks like conversation. Sometimes it just looks like not leaving. And I drank that coffee slower than usual, not because I wanted to savor it. The hardest part wasn't when things got loud, when the panic was obvious or the sadness spilled over in ways I couldn't contain. It was the days when everything inside me went quiet. When the world felt like it was moving through me instead of around me, and I became a shadow of my own shape, still showing up to things, still answering questions with smiles that didn't reach my eyes, still laughing in the right places, but not really feeling any of it. And I don't think anyone noticed, not really, because I had learned how to wear okay like a second skin. But somehow you always did, always looked a little longer, listened a little deeper, like you could hear the missing sound in the silence I didn't know how to explain. And it was on one of those in-between days when I walked into the room and you were already there, cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a mess of papers and sketches, music humming low in the background, and without even looking up, You said, "You don't have to talk today if you don't want to." And that was it. No questions, no pressure. Just a space made ready for me without expectation. And I sat down near you. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the warmth of being invited. And we stayed like that for what could have been an hour or a lifetime, you drawing slow lines and me just existing. And I remember thinking that if anyone else had walked in, they wouldn't have seen anything important happening. But I knew that something in me had shifted simply because I was allowed to be. And that night when I went home, I didn't feel fixed or better or even lighter, but I felt held in this invisible way that stayed long after the moment ended. Like I had been given permission to fall apart in silence and still be worthy of company. And I think that was the first time I truly understood what it meant to land softly, not because I avoided the crash, but because someone stayed to cushion it. Someone made space where I didn't have to make sense. Someone who didn't need me to explain the ache in order to stand beside it. And from then on, every time things went quiet again, every time the stillness inside me felt too heavy to carry alone, I would think of that moment. That floor, that quiet music, and you there, steady and gentle and impossibly human. And I'd remember that softness doesn't mean weakness, and presence doesn't always come with answers, and love doesn't always have to be loud to be life-saving. And even when I couldn't ask for it, you always knew how to offer it anyway. It was the day everything finally cracked when I realized just how much you had become my anchor. Because it wasn't one big thing that broke MIT, was the accumulation of small, invisible weights I had been carrying without complaint, without language, without rest. And that morning I woke up with a tightness in my chest I couldn't stretch away, a noise in my head that wouldn't dim no matter how still I sat. And I tried all the usual things: music, walking, pretending to be busy, pretending to be fine, but nothing softened it, nothing worked. And by noon, I was curled in a corner of my room, phone screen lit beside me, staring at your contact name without the energy to press call, without the strength to admit I needed someone. And I don't know how or why you reached out when you did. Just a simple message: want me to come over. No pressure, just air and tea and space. And I didn't reply. Couldn't reply. But 20 minutes later, you were at my door anyway, holding 2 cups and wearing that expression that always seemed to know the version of me I was trying not to show. And when I opened the door, you didn't ask anything, didn't flinch at my red eyes or the way my hands were shaking or how I couldn't look you in the face. You just stepped inside, set the cups down, and sat on the floor like you'd been there 1,000 times before. Like this wasn't something broken, but something sacred. And I didn't mean to fall into you, but I did, slowly at first. Like leaning into warmth after a long winter. And then, all at once, like every uncried tear had been waiting for this permission. And you held me like you weren't afraid of the heaviness. Like it was okay if I didn't have words, like it was okay if I didn't come back together right away, or ever. And we stayed like that. No timeline, no goal, no performance. Just breath and presence and the small, quiet miracle of being allowed to unravel in front of someone who doesn't mistake it for weakness. And afterward, when I finally pulled away and tried to apologize, you stopped me with the softest look and said, "You don't owe me strength to deserve softness." And I don't think anyone had ever said anything like that to me before. Not in words or actions, and something about it stitched itself into me. Something about it became a light I would carry through all the days that followed. Because you didn't just show up, you knew how to hold the pieces without cutting yourself. You knew how to stay without demanding more than I could give. And that kind of love, that kind of friendship, it doesn't make the pain disappear, but it makes it survivable. And in a world that had so often asked me to be smaller, quieter, easier, you made space for all of me. Even the mess, even the silence, even the days I didn't know how to land. Anywhere except next to you, there was something about the way you knocked on my door that evening that told me. You already knew I wouldn't answer. Not because I didn't want to see you, but because I didn't know how to open the door without letting everything spill out. And you waited there anyway, long enough for me to hear your breathing through the wood. Long enough for your presence. To press gently into the silence like a question without demand. And eventually, you slid a folded piece of paper beneath the door. Nothing dramatic, just your handwriting in soft black ink that read, "I'll be on the stairs for a while if it helps." And somehow it did, not because you said the right thing, but because you said the true thing, the kind thing. It's the kind of thing that meets a person in their cave without asking them to come out before they're ready. And after a while, I sat on the other side of the door with my back pressed against it, listening to the soft echo of your footsteps settling nearby. Not talking, not moving, just being. And I think there's a kind of healing that happens in the quiet company of someone who doesn't need you to perform your pain in order to care about it. Someone who can sit in the not knowing with you and not make it awkward or heavy or worse than it already is. And that night, though the door never opened, something inside me did. Something long locked away that had learned to survive by isolation and caution, and maybe it wasn't obvious to anyone else. But that moment was a hinge in the story, a turning point in the way I understood what it meant to be loved without condition. Because it's one thing to show up when someone's smiling and engaging and emotionally available. And it's another thing entirely to show up when someone can't even say hello. When they're on the floor in yesterday's clothes, afraid of their own breath, and still choose to sit close enough to be felt without needing to be seen. And when I finally opened the door hours later, you were gone. But the thermos you'd left behind was still warm. And the note had been replaced with another one that just said, "Still here tomorrow." And I stared at those 3 words for a long time because I didn't know people like you existed. People who loved so quietly, so steadily, so bravely. And I made a silent promise to myself in that moment that if I ever found the strength to stand again, I would tell you what that meant to me, what you meant to me, how your friendship didn't just keep me company, kept me alive. And I never forgot that. Not for a single day after, because while everyone else told me to call if I needed anything, you came anyway. And that difference, that small, radical difference, became the softest, strongest truth I've ever held. I thought about disappearing again, not in some dramatic or final way, just in the quiet, practiced way I'd always done when life felt too sharp to touch. When existing started to feel more like performance than presence, and I told myself it would only be for a day, maybe 2. Just enough time to pull back into the shadows where no one would expect anything from me, where I didn't have to respond or smile or explain why the sunlight felt heavier than usual. But old habits don't die quietly, and before I knew it, I had stopped replying to your messages. Not because I didn't want to talk to you, but because I didn't know how to say, "I'm not okay" again, and I don't know why. And I could see the unread texts stacking up like gentle taps on a door. Couldn't open, and then they stopped, not abruptly, not coldly. Just paused, and that pause scared me more than the silence ever did. Because I realized then how much I had begun to depend on your steadiness, your consistency, your subtle reminders that I wasn't invisible no matter how quiet I became. And just when I started to think I'd pushed too far, that maybe this time I'd finally proven I was too much work, too much distance, too much silence, you showed up. Not with anger or questions, but with soup in a thermos, a bag of oranges, and that soft look in your eyes that somehow always saw right through me without making me feel exposed. And you didn't ask why I'd gone quiet, didn't ask anything at all. You just stepped into my space like it was still yours too. Like my withdrawal hadn't built a wall you weren't willing to climb. And you sat with me in my mess, not cleaning it, not judging it, just being there. Like presence itself was enough to remind me I wasn't lost. Just tired. And that night, after you left, I scrolled through the messages I hadn't answered it. One its own quiet offering. I realized how much love I'd been given without having to earn it. How many times you had chosen to stay close, even when I drifted away. And something in me cracked open again, not in pain this time, but in the fragile relief of knowing I was loved without being chased. And that was when it finally hit me that you had become the place I disappeared to. Not from the only presence that didn't make my silence feel like abandonment, but like breath, like refuge, like a soft return to something I hadn't known I needed until you kept showing up and proving that friendship, when it's real, doesn't flinch at distance. It just waits with warmth and patience and the kind of love that doesn't ask you to be okay before it chooses to stay. I didn't expect to cry that night. Not at that party. Not surrounded by noise and laughter and the hum of lights strung across someone else's rooftop. But grief doesn't wait for silence, and sometimes it doesn't ask permission to arrive. It just slips beneath your ribs mid-sentence. And suddenly, the drink in your hand feels heavier than your body, and the music feels like it's mocking you and everyone else seems wrapped in a joy you can't touch. And I stood there with a smile I'd worn too long, nodding at conversations I wasn't present for. And I could feel it rising, this wave of emotion I'd kept pressed down all weekend. I didn't know where to put it. Didn't know where to go that wouldn't make me feel like a burden. And just as I was about to quietly slip away down the stairs and vanish into the night, I saw you across the crowd, already looking at me. Already reading the moment like it was a language you'd memorized, and you didn't wave or call out or make a scene. You just started walking toward me with that calm steadiness you always carry, like gravity itself softens around you. And when you reached me, you didn't ask what was wrong, didn't ask anything at all. You just placed your hand gently on my back and said, "Want to sit somewhere quiet?" And I nodded before the tears could start, and we found a bench on the side of the house near the garden, lit only by the flicker of someone's forgotten candle. And I sat with my hands in my lap, trying to hold the ache in place. And you just let me sit there. Didn't rush me, didn't try to distract me with platitudes, just stayed close enough to remind me I wasn't alone. And eventually the tears came, not loudly, not dramatically, but slow and steady, like the unraveling of a knot that had been pulled too tightly for too long, and you passed me a tissue from your pocket like you always seemed to have one ready. And when I finally whispered, "I'm sorry," your voice was soft but firm as you said, "Don't apologize for feeling something." And I don't think I'd ever been told that in such a moment. Not like that, not with such understanding. And I realized that what you offered wasn't just support, was sanctuary. A refuge from performance, a permission to feel without shame. And by the time we walked back through the house to leave, my eyes were puffy and my chest was sore, but I wasn't pretending anymore. I wasn't hiding behind anything, and it was because of you, because you made it safe to be real, even in a room full of noise, because you never needed me to be the version of myself I showed the world. You always made space for the one underneath. The one who sometimes cried at parties, and sometimes disappeared, and sometimes didn't know what she needed until you were already handing it to her before she asked. And that kind of friendship, that kind of love, it isn't loud, but it echoes longer than anything I've ever known. I didn't expect you to notice the way I flinched when you mentioned the future, the way my fingers curled slightly inward, or how I looked away too quickly, pretending to check something on my phone that wasn't there because I had become so used to people who never saw the shifts, the flickers, the small ruptures that lived in the pauses between my words. But you did. You always did. And I don't know how you knew that the future was something I didn't let myself picture, that it scared me more than the past ever did, that making plans felt like daring something cruel to interrupt them. But you never pushed, never forced dreams into my hands like they were healing. You just left the door open gently every time, saying things like, "We'll go there someday," or "if you ever feel up for it." And letting the idea of someday be soft and wide, and not something I had to grip. And it was on a Sunday evening, quiet and golden and unremarkable in every way, when you brought over a puzzle and a playlist and said, "Let's just exist today." And for some reason, that undid me more than anything else, because I realized how often people asked me to be more than I could give, to explain, to commit, to plan, to perform resilience, but you just asked me to exist. And it was the first time in months I didn't feel like I had to outrun my own mind. And as we sat on the floor piecing together the edges of 1,000 fragmented images, I found myself laughing at something small, something ordinary, and I heard it for what it was: light. Real surprising, and I looked up at you to say something about how strange it felt to feel okay. Even briefly, but you were already watching me with that same quiet wonder you always reserve for the moments I didn't know I was glowing. And you said, "You're allowed to have joy," and I don't think I'd ever really believed that before. Not fully, not without waiting for the crash that always seemed to follow, but you said it like a truth I'd forgotten. Like you were handing it back to me without condition, and for the first time, I believed that maybe joy didn't always have to be earned through suffering. Maybe it didn't have to feel like guilt dressed in gold. Maybe it could just arrive, quietly, and be held without fear. And that night, long after you'd gone, I left the puzzle on the floor unfinished and sat near. I didn't know it was the last time we'd sit on that old bench behind the cafe. The one with peeling paint and names carved into the wood like stories whispered in splinters. Because that's how endings often arrive, not with fanfare or certainty, but in quiet, ordinary moments you only realize were sacred once they've passed. And that afternoon felt like any other, a slow breeze weaving through late sunlight, your cup warming your palms while mine sat untouched beside me. And we didn't talk about anything monumental, just small things: how the tree above us had finally started to bloom, how someone left a scarf behind last week, how your latest sketch wouldn't cooperate tanned. I remember thinking, this feels like home, not the kind with walls or furniture or addresses, but the kind built out of consistent presence, of quiet witnessing, of being loved without the need to constantly explain yourself. And something about the way you looked at me that day, like you could sense the shift before I could name it, made my throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with gratitude. Because no one had ever stayed this long before. No one had ever memorized my silences the way you had. No one had ever let me be this version of myself, uncertain, unfolding, and still chosen me every time. And when you reached into your bag and handed me that folded piece of paper, I smiled without opening it, already knowing it wasn't advice or poetry or anything performative, but something simple, something real, and I tucked it into my pocket without looking because I wanted to save it for later, for when the quiet felt too wide again. And now I wish I'd read it then, not because it would have changed anything, but because maybe I would have found the courage to tell you everything in that moment. How your friendship saved me in ways I'll never fully explain. How you held space for the pieces of me I used to be ashamed of. How your presence was the first thing that didn't feel conditional. And how being with you didn't fix me, but made me feel like I didn't have to be fixed to be loved on when you stood up and said, "Same time next week." I nodded like always, not knowing that life would shift quietly in the background, that new jobs and cities and chapters would rewrite the shape of our routine. But here's the thing I hold on to even now, even as seasons change and messages become more spaced out and time stretches thin. What you gave me isn't something time can erase. Because you weren't just a chapter in my life, you were the margin where I scrawled safe, the underline beneath every moment I dared to feel, the soft landing I never thought I'd be given and now carry inside me like breath. And no matter how far the map stretches between us, no matter how often our paths cross or don't. I know this. You were the friend who taught me that I could be both broken and beloved. That softness doesn't need to be earned, and that's some. People don't just walk with you through the fire. They wait beside the ashes and stay until you can build something beautiful from them again. It had been weeks since we last spoke, not because anything was wrong, not because there was a fight or a fracture, but because life has this way of scattering even the closest souls like dandelion seeds on the wind. And for a while I told myself it was fine. That space was normal. That growing up meant growing apart sometimes. But what I didn't say out loud, what lived in the quieter corners of my chest, was how much I missed you. Not just your presence, but the version of me I only ever seemed to be when you were around. The softer one, the lighter one, the one who laughed from the belly instead of the mouth. And I think I kept waiting for you to reach out first because I was scared that if I did, find out I'd imagined it all. That maybe the closeness had faded for you, even if it still pulsed in me like an unfinished melody. But you never stopped echoing through the smallest parts of my day every time I passed a bench in soft light, every time I heard the rustle of pages or the clink of a thermos lid, every time someone asked me if I was okay and I wished it was you asking. Because you never asked in a way that demanded answers. You just asked in a way that made it easier to breathe in than one night. Without much thought, I sent you a photo of the old bookstore we used to sit behind, captioned only with "still here," and within minutes your reply came. A heart and a single word always. I felt something release in me that had been clenched too long, something like proof that distance hadn't dissolved what we built. That quiet didn't mean forgotten, and soon we were sending messages again, not all at once, not in a flood, but like stones across a still lake, small, intentional. Reverent Tand, every word felt like a reunion. Every silence afterward felt like a warm hand resting instead of a door closing. And it reminded me of how rare that kind of friendship is. The kind that doesn't expire in absence, the kind that holds shape even in the dark. And when we finally met up again, sitting side by side on that cold curb outside the station, you said nothing for the first 5 minutes, and neither did I, and it was perfect. Because what needed to be said was already understood, already pulsing in the space between us. And when you finally turned to me and said, "You look like you've been carrying a lot," I nodded, not to agree, but to let go, and you passed me the old thermos, now scratched and dented and still holding warmth. And I realized then that what we had was not just memory, it was presence. It was permission. It was permanence disguised in the gentleness of temporary things. And I think that's what love looks like in its quietest form. Not a loud declaration, but a return. Not a grand gesture, but a knowing hand. Not a perfect ending, but a place to land. It was late when you called, your voice soft but urgent, like you weren't sure whether I'd pick up but needed me to anyway. And I was already halfway through saying hello when I realized you hadn't spoken yet. Just breathing on the other end of the line like silence was safer than words. And I knew that feeling because I'd lived inside it too, so I didn't ask what was wrong or say talk to me. I just said I'm here the way you always had for me. And after a long pause, you whispered, I didn't know who else to call. And something about that cracked open a space in me I didn't know was still tender. Because you were the strong one, the steady one, the one who held me when I unraveled. But now it was you, unraveling. And I realized in that moment that true friendship isn't just about being held. It's about knowing when to hold. And I told you to come over. Didn't even wait for you to answer before I was already putting the kettle on and setting out the old blanket we always used when the world felt too loud. And when you arrived, you looked like someone who had been brave. For far too long, like someone who needed permission to stop pretending they were okay. And you didn't say anything as you walked in. Just dropped your bag on the floor and stood there for a second like you weren't sure if it was safe to fall apart. And I crossed the room without a word and wrapped my arms around you before your body could decide whether to resist or collapse. And you melted into me like breath into fog. Like you had been holding yourself together for days, and this was the first time anyone had told you it was okay to let go. And we stayed like that for a long time, not crying, not talking, just being still in the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of trust. Full of the unspoken history between us, full of all the ways we've shown up for each other. When it mattered most, man, when you finally pulled away. It had been raining all day. It's not the kind of storm that screams against windows, but the gentle kind. The kind that makes everything slow and reflective. And I found myself walking the long way home past all the places that still carried echoes. Of us, an alley where we once danced in the dark for no reason. A bench where you once cried and told me you didn't want to keep pretending to be strong. A cafe that always saved our table without being asked tanned. I didn't mean to go looking for you in these places, but maybe a part of me always is. Even now, even after everything has shifted into this new, quieter season where we don't talk every day, where life has grown up around us like ivy and tangled the hours into something harder to reach through. But still, I feel you everywhere, not like a ghost, but like a thread, woven gently through the fabric of who I've become. And that day, in the soft hush of that rain, I found myself stopping in front of the old bookstore where we used to meet. And I almost didn't go in. Not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure I could hold the weight of memory without letting it spill out all over the shelves. But then I remembered the way you used to say, "Some places remember us." And I stepped inside. And it smelled the same like paper and dust and time, and I wandered to the back where the windows fogged up in winter and the seats were always slightly too low. And I sat there alone, but not really, because the space still felt full of you. And I pulled out my notebook, the one you gave me when I couldn't say things out loud yet, and I started to write not a story, not a poem, just truth. Just this quiet unraveling of everything I still carry. Everything I still owe to. The way you loved me without ever asking me to perform. And as the page filled with words I hadn't planned, I realized how much I missed you, not just your presence, but your questions, your silences. Your ability to make even the most fragile parts of me feel holy, and I wondered if you knew. If you still carried pieces of me too, if somewhere across the city or the country or the world you ever paused in your day and felt me thinking of you. And maybe you did, because that night, as I sat in my room with the rain still soft against the window, my phone lit up with your name. And the message was short: "I saw someone today who looked like you, and I missed you so much it hurt." And I didn't hesitate before replying, "Me too." And it wasn't a grand moment or a movie scene or some declaration of reunion. It was just enough, just presence, just proof that the bond between us hadn't dissolved, only stretched. And I lay there in the quiet afterward, thinking how lucky I've been not to have been fixed, but to have been held, not to have been saved, but to have been believed in. And maybe that's what you'll always be to me, not just a friend, not just a memory, but a place, a person. A presence where I finally learned I didn't have to shrink to be safe. Where I could breathe and break and rebuild and still be loved. I didn't know how to say goodbye. Not because we were ending, but because something in me still hoped we never really would. Because what do you call it when someone becomes part of your breath, your memory, your map, and then life quietly and without malice pulls you into different directions? And suddenly, you're not sure when you'll next sit across from each other, or laugh in the same rhythm, or cry in the same room. And the truth is, I always thought there'd be more time, more long walks with no destination, more cups of tea. On rainy afternoons, more nights where one of us knocked gently on the other's door without needing to explain why. But now, the moments are less frequent, the updates shorter, and even though we always promise soon, I've come to understand that soon doesn't always come when you want it to. But even still, Evan, in the pauses, even in the distance, nothing about you feels like it's fading, because some people don't need to be present to be with you. They become part of the quiet you carry, the soft echo in your chest that answers when you're too tired to speak. And maybe that's what you've always been for me, not a constant noise, but a consistent warmth. A place I return to even when I don't realize I'm returning. And when we met for what might have been the last time in that small park that somehow still held all our laughter like roots hold rain. We didn't talk about endings. We didn't count the time or name the changes. We just sat close, our knees almost touching, our stories overlapping and meandering like they always had. And when the sun began to dip and the shadows stretched long over the grass, you turned to me and said, "No matter what changes, this doesn't." And I felt it, not just the truth in your words, but the history behind them, every moment you'd stayed, every silence you'd honored, every breakdown you'd held without needing to fix them. I wanted to tell you everything in that moment. Wanted to say how you were the first person who made me feel like I didn't have to apologize for being complicated. How your friendship had stitched a softness into my bones that I would never stop carrying. How even now, years later, when the world gets too loud or too sharp, your voice is still the one I hear telling me to breathe, to sit, to stay. But I didn't say all of that. I just reached over and squeezed your hand, and that was enough, because we've never needed to fill the silence between us with noise. And when we finally stood and hugged,